the band man came out and said, do I have a request? Anybody like to hear a special number? And one guy said, play Dixie. And boy, that band, they cut loose on Dixie. And then one of the white guys jumped up and said, yoo-hoo, the Coons are in here tonight. And I told my wife, I said, we better get out of here, because look, she said, I think so too. So we finished our drink, and when we walked out, the band played Bye Bye Blackbird. And so anyway, one of the most funniest experiences we had, the Harvard University School of Journalism sent some students down to set up a civil rights newspaper, and the Ford Foundation funded them. So we befriended these kids from the college. And so one weekend we decided to go to Callaway Garden, where Florida State University had a circus camp up there. So we goes up to Callaway Garden for the weekend, and we had the wine and the cheese, and we had the chairs and blankets. And so one of the, I think 19 whites and about 7 blacks. And so one of the girls saw the little black fella getting kind of nervous, and so he said that she was drinking wine pretty heavy, so she said she had a little blonde wig on her head. So she took it off and put it on his head. Everybody started laughing. People passed by looking. And so my old friend that went with us, he said, man, y'all cut that out. He said, let's be playing with this and race stuff. And I said, you know what? I said, Reverend King died for this. He said, hell, man, I don't want to die. I don't want to take it all the time. Huh? Yeah. Okay, the question. Can I read this by Reverend King about the integration? Okay. The Reverend King said about the integration of the schools. He said that I favor integration of buses and in all areas of public accommodation and travel. I am for equality. However, I think integration in our public schools is different. In the setting, you are dealing with one of the most important assets of the individual, the mind. White people view black people as inferior. A large percentage of them have a very low opinion of our race. People with such a low view of the black race cannot be given free range and put in charge of the intellectual care and development of our boys and girls. He went on to say, I don't see school integration successfully happening right now and being beneficial. I think the school system will have a problem. It will be disastrous. Training will be necessary. White educators especially will need training in how to deal with black children. They will have to come to grips with their prejudice. Without such training, I don't think it will work. Love, tolerance, and respect on the part of white people and black people are mandatory if integration is work in the public school. Okay, Father, said the question for you.
Which one do you want? Y'all, if you can share that one. Okay, I want to thank the panelists for those initial comments. One of the statements that I heard made me think that there was always a continuing struggle within the African American community that preceded the bus boycott, and that question was, what is the best way for us to achieve equality? What is the best way for us to advance equal rights for all men and women in this country? And classically, before the era of the bus boycott, the division was between those who argued for education in a certain way, as Dr. W.B. Du Bois did, and those who argued for education in a more practical way, as Booker T. Washington did. And so I found it very intriguing when I heard both in Mr. Hardy's comments and in Mr. Williams' comments that there were two stalwarts in the Montgomery movement, Mr. Lewis and Mr. E.D. Nixon. And so I want to pose to them particularly to give some insight into how the approach of those two men, because I think eventually the movement came to believe that it was not an either-or situation, but really was a both-and, as Mr. Malden's comments just revealed. And so I'd like them to at least share some insight on either Mr. Nixon or Mr. Lewis and their role in this movement.
I had more dealings with Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis was a person who went about teaching voter registration. That was his mantra. He owned a club here in Montgomery called the Citizens Club for a number of years. And the whole idea was that he connected with his churches, and they had places where they would go and teach people the questions that you heard read by Mr. Malden. And the irony of that, my father was one of the persons who, he was the contact person in our church, Weaverville Baptist Church, for the community outreach at the time. And so anything he wanted, he didn't need to do, didn't want to do, he would put me involved with it. So Mr. Lewis had one of these old Chryslers at the time. He was in the funeral business, so he had a nice car. And I would go to various people's houses in various communities in North Montgomery, and you had to let them know it's okay. You know, we're gonna be learning this. And my father was in the teaching session, and my father went to take this test. My father was teaching, and the first time he didn't pass. Now, to bring credence to what Mr. Malden said, Mr. Williams, I think, where they had a limit, the number were going to pass that day. My father was handling the questions, and I guess the day that he had reached that limit, he didn't pass. And the only time I ever saw him cry, like, was when in our store, the postman came in one day and he saw the envelope. He didn't know what was in it, but he knew it was from the Board of Registrars, and he said, "Deacon, I got good news for you today." And sure enough, he opened the envelope and saw he had passed. My mother had already passed, you see, so they were messing with the house. You know, they let her, she got through and it stopped my father. But eventually he did pass. And it was so Mr. Lewis was very, very efficient in working, in educating the people. And, you know, it was just miraculous. People who had no real foundation, that they did commit themselves to learn that information well enough to pass the test. And I think it's a tremendous tribute to them and that steadfastness of the times. And you can see the difficulty of the questions. I mean, you know, none of us will be voting.
Well, not too much different from what Dr. Hardy said, except that Mr. Nixon also take his Cadillac Chrysler, whatever, and take you down there. He would load you up and take you down there. He was a hard worker, and I used to talk with him all the time. We had a restaurant, a cafe here, was the Rega's Cafe, and this is where, when all the civil rights workers and movement workers would come to town, this is the place where they would eat. It was the name of Mr. Liggins. He was a postman, and that's the place where they had to eat at. They couldn't eat downtown naturally in other restaurants. And one thing I did feel to say was that all of you should know that the movement, the Montgomery movement, do a lot of credit, great deal of credit to the poor peoples, the maids, the janitors, the sanitation workers, because without them, it wouldn't have been no movement. They was tired, and everybody else was tired, but they the one that really was the backbone of the movement. They thought it was going to be like Dr. Hardy said earlier, 1 day, 2 day, but they stuck with it. And I can say one thing, that's one time that Montgomery black people really stuck together. And that really was a success of the boycott. Without them, it wouldn't have been no boycott. We had tried something maybe before. We won't ride the bus today, but that had gotten old. And then this thing stuck as Ms. Park didn't get up. So they do a lot of credit. And I'm not saying that, you know, other people worrying about their job, but they didn't worry about the job. They wasn't making much anyway. So they stuck with it, and that was one of the great things that happened in Montgomery, with the black people and poor people in Montgomery.
A lot of people throughout the country say, how did black people in Montgomery, Alabama stay together 381 days without any real breakup? And I think the common denominator, reason we was able to stay together, was every black person had been on the bus, whether you was short, tall, whether you was a doctor, whether you was a cook or whatever your profession, that bus driver had insulted you. So the common denominator was already not so much the leadership, but it was the common denominator. We had all been insulters. See, Reverend King and Mrs. Parks was the star of the show, but then the producers and the directors behind that were people like Mrs. Bakes and Mr. Lewis. And Mr. Lewis and Mr. Liggett. See, Mr. Liggett had the Rigger Cafe, and he would let Reverend King use his facilities when the crowd was too large for his house or too small for the church to be open. So Mr. Liggett had a conference room. He would let his business be used, which most black businessmen was afraid to let that business be used because of retaliation from the city fathers. And Mr. Goldsmith, the man owner of the BMO Hotel, would let some of the students stay up there, especially some of the civil rights students from San Francisco State University. 15 students stayed up there in the hotel. He let them stay free. And the city of Montgomery asked them to put them out on the street where they could arrest them, but he refused. And of course, after that, they came up with some crooked up charge about revenue tax. So anyway, those were the only two businesses would let that business be used. And when the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1964, they were the first two to go out of business because they could not compete with the Holiday Inns and other places.
Mr. Hardy?
Let me just punctuate one other thing that I feel has relevance to this question. The overall participation at every level, and going with the university people, Alabama State University, obviously, if you think of the times, those people were under a lot of scrutiny. And let me take the one person whose name has not been called yet. That was Miss Joanne Robinson, I think. Now, Miss Robinson and another person whose name escapes me now, I understand, stayed up all night. Now, not with a duplicating machine, not with a copy machine that you know now. They cranked out in a mimeograph machine with all that ink and all that stuff to go with it and everything, with all night to get the flyers out that were encouraging the persons to stay off of the buses. Dr. J.E. Pierce, who taught social science, Dr. B.J. Sims were persons who put together the logistics for the transportation of the carpool. And I just say one other thing about the ingeniousness of the carpool. They walked all around the law regarding running a bus line without a license, without a franchise. And when they moved to the level that we shared rides, they decided they would buy these station wagons. Now, if you go down there to Montgomery, Rosa Parks Museum, you see the Hope Street Baptist Church. That station wagon now, 56 Chevrolet station wagon. When that money was raised and they came back in the community, then the plan was the name of a church would go on the station wagon, and when they would be stopped, it would not be a bus service. You know, the church is moving its members to where they had to go, and they couldn't prove anything differently. And of course, it was very successful with this particular movement in that regards. And it was up until the Supreme Court had ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. And Dr. King has said in his book, A Knock at Midnight, the night he had to go speak to the mass meeting because it was a point that things were getting tough. And he really didn't want to have to speak to him that night. But early in the day, this court order came down that same day. And of course, at that point, it gave new life to do what we had to do to continue. But there were defining moments along the way where it did take the courage of a strong leader. I don't want to downplay the significance of having the right person at the right time. As Mr. Williams already indicated, other efforts had been tried in this city to make a difference. It was a divine intervention that Dr. King would be the person who would lead this movement. And I would say, being a child of the movement, I don't know anyone else in the world that could have held the people off of those buses for 381 days successfully. He had a lot of tools that he would use. One of them, I would remember when he would come in churches, my mother was on a committee called the telephone committee. And her job was anytime he's coming back, he's been out raising money, he's going to be in church that night, calling people who need to be in the church. They felt the best thing they could do would have the church packed every time he came in.